Hi, I'm Catherine Reid, and coming up next on the St. Paul Forum, I'm talking with Kent Nerburn, author of the trilogy that begins with the book, Neither Wolf Nor Dog. That's next on the St. Paul Forum. Welcome to the St. Paul Forum. I'm Catherine Reid, and joining me today is author Kent Nerburn. Welcome, Kent.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So, your trilogy that started with the book Neither Wolf Nor Dog, is now culminating with your newest book, The Girl Who Sang to the Buffalo,
right,
which has just been released. This has been a 20-year
odyssey.
Journey. Yes. Tell us about how you began this journey.
I actually fell into it by a bit of good fortune, personally and economic misfortune. I was trained as a sculptor, and I've tried to make my living as a sculptor, but it was, you're fishing with a single hook and trying to make a living. And what I found I needed to find some kind of work that would pay the bills. And I'd been fascinated with the native point of view on art, because as a sculptor, I tried very hard to deal with aesthetic issues of application of ideas to material. But ultimately, when I worked in trees, the trees talked back. And I would look for aesthetic philosophies and models that spoke of that, and the only one that actually did it was the native people. I talk about how the Iroquois would carve masks out of live trees because they wanted the spirit of the tree in the mask. This struck me, and so when the opportunity came to do some work with the native community, I said, this is something here that I want to try to explore a little further. So I fell into the opportunity of doing an oral history project on Red Lake, and the end result of that was collecting memories of the tribal elders, speaking to the elders, taking the students out to interview them. And when I got done with that project, I said I wanted to do more. These were great people. I learned a great deal, and I wanted to share more. And so these books are the result.
Wonderful. So let's, did you grow up you live in Bemidji now, or northern?
We just moved out, but I've been there for 25 years.
Okay, and was that where you were living when you came to the Red Lake Reservation?
Yes, Red Lake is 30 miles north of Bemidji. It's one of the 2 or 3 closed reservations in the country, meaning the land is held in common. It's never been part of the United States. It's never been parceled up and sold off. So you're really going into a foreign country when you go to Red Lake. And it has this feel that's different from other reservations, where they know that they're a separate nation. Mm-hmm. You feel it, and you just feel yourself in the presence of a different world and different worldview. And I loved it. I loved the place. I loved the people. It was just a very different experience to me to drive into a reservation and feel like I'd crossed a boundary. And when I'd come home at night, I crossed the boundary again, back into America.
So the idea of these conversations, the gathering of the oral histories, really is a wonderful template for the work that became these 3 books.
Absolutely.
Because it really is about listening, as I understand it, and it's in dialogue. It's this conversation between different people, but especially between 2 individuals. Tell us a little bit about how that was for the students. It obviously had a huge impact on you, but had they been gathering those oral histories before?
No, they hadn't. That was one of the joyful accidents of the whole process, is that most of the parents, and especially the grandparents, had not spoken about their past. They valued education greatly. They wanted their children and grandchildren to have the opportunity to get a Western education, but they'd traditionally been the teachers. But they had gone silent. They'd gone silent partly because they wanted to respect the education their students were getting, and partly because so many of them had been told in their time in the boarding schools which I write about in The Wolf at Twilight, that their tradition was worthless and that they shouldn't speak of these things. So when they were asked to talk, the stories poured out of them. They were wonderful stories, and they loved having the kids there. They loved being the teachers once again. And my job was to just get out of the way and let the students sit at their feet and hear the elders. And so I fell into a situation where I was doing something that was not just a good educational experience, it was good in terms of a healing process for everyone.
And how long did that go on for you?
2 years,
Just
2.5
2 years, yeah. So this 2-year experience, which obviously opened things up for a lot of people there and had a huge impact on you, turned into this 20-year project.
Right.
And if you could just talk about, as you said, there was a change in the leadership because there were, as you said, it was both fortunate and unfortunate. You had the good fortune to turn to this teaching experience, but the winds changed. And
the winds changed. I mean, reservation politics anywhere are very tough stuff. I made a decision that proved in the long run I should have read my Machiavelli a little more closely to try to be neutral. I just wanted to be clear water through which stories were told and used my skills to put them out there. But there are deep-seated histories among families in various clans, and people want you to pick one side or the other. I didn't want to, and as a result, both sides tended to, on occasion, see me as someone that wasn't totally trustworthy. I became a very close friend of Roger Jourdain, who was the tribal leader. But Roger had been in since 1958 or 59, and when he got sent out, he was sent out with a vengeance. And I got caught in the wake. And it was sad because I'd really put together a good project with the students. It wasn't just oral history. It was honor the past, serve the present, and prepare for the future. We went out and talked to the elders. We also worked in the nursing home and in the elderly nutrition center, giving meals to people, and then I took them to college at Bemidji State. I thought we had something that really could have carried on. But unfortunately, like I said, a new broom sweeps clean. I got swept out. And I was heartbroken because I lost my connection. And at the same time, I knew that what I had seen and what I'd been part of was so essential. I often say I felt like I was not doing something important, I was doing something essential. And I wanted to give back to the broader Native community, and I wanted to also tell the world that doesn't really understand the inside of Native experience what it was like.
You also really help, you get to the ground of the relationship really to this land and the people. And I'd just like you to set the stage a little bit for this important first conversation in the first book in the trilogy, if you would, and kind of set the stage for us about why it's so important to have this dialogue.
The book really was, and one more fortuitous accident. When we got done with the oral history books, there were 2 of them, To Walk the Red Road and We Choose to Remember. They traveled around on the powwow circuit. And the people were very proud to hand them up because there were photographs, they were stories, and no one had ever seen anything done quite like this, so it went to different tribes. And it ended up in the hands of a man in the Dakotas who liked what he saw. A lot of people liked what they saw. They said, it's good stuff that this guy's doing. And he wanted me to tell some of his story. And his name was Dan. So Neither Wolf Nor Dog is based on my encounters with Dan and an attempt to tell what, not his, I expected it was going to be his personal story, but it really wasn't. It was his view of how Native people look at the world, how Native people look at the dominant culture that's taken over their lives, and their belief in things like the difference between land and property, the difference between freedom and honor, their feelings about death, their feelings about the land, their feelings about the power of animals. And he said, use me as a vehicle to tell the stories. You know, make it sound like I went to Haskell, which was the Indian college. He didn't want to sound like a He didn't want
Make
to.
it sound like I
He
went to
didn't
the
either
college.
want to be speaking for all Native people, nor did he want to sound like he was semi-literate, or he didn't want tom-tom philosophy, as he put it. He wanted me to tell the story, and he said, if you have good stories that can fit in my voice, fit them all in. So I took the best of what it is that I had heard, and I was constantly listening. I'd learned to be an auditor and a watcher in the course of my time doing the Red Road books, as I call them. And so what this first book is a story of what he wants everyone to know about the Native understanding of the world, Native understanding of the contact with the non-Native communities. And it really is very much grounded in the land, in the belief that we are not on top of the land, we are one with the land. It was a very insightful philosophical point of view that he had, even though it wasn't necessarily expressed with great sophistication.
And, I'd like to have you read from the second book, which is, as you said, based on the schools and the boarding schools, right, and the tragedy of those schools. It also is a way in which there's a passage at the end where he's talking about the urgency of us to have this understanding that you express and do such a great job of describing in the first book. So maybe you could read that passage and set that up for us.
Sure, and I'll tell you in general, the books are a progression through different levels of understanding and different types of experience that the Native people have had and want to share. And in Neither Wolf Nor Dog, a lot of people came out of that. I have to say, I'm no great lover of New Age appropriation of Native subjects, or even of a non-Native person appropriating Native teachings. But in this book, people thought so much of what Dan said, and they liked Dan so much, they came out of it with this, oh, these Indians are such wonderful people. Tell me more about these wonderful Indians. Well, the Native people also have had a very dark past. And obviously we know the things that happened historically, at least some of them, but the boarding school experience where the kids were taken from their parents, had their hair cut, sometimes their heads washed in lye, they were beaten if they spoke their own language. 4 or 5-year-old kids ripped away from their families and told that their grandparents were going to some place called hell that they didn't know about and that they should never listen to them. The trauma was monumental. So this book really focused on telling the stories of the boarding schools. And Dan, in this book, and towards the end, he wants to teach. He wants to get his story out. He's old. The guy's in his 80s, and he says, this might be my last chance. So there is an urgency on his part to tell the stories, tell what he thinks people need to know, non-Native people, as well as to give voice to his own beliefs.
One second, just. If you're just joining us, I'm speaking with Kent Nerburn, author of the trilogy that begins with the book Neither Wolf Nor Dog. So read from Dan his urgent message to us.
And Dan, I have my tape recorder, which he calls my white man's ears. And he says, make sure they're still awake. And I held up the recorder so he could hear the whirring of the wheels. They're still awake, I said. Good, now let us go a little further on this trail. The greatest weakness of your people is that you do not know how to listen. You've closed your ears to other voices. Not just the voices of other people, but the voices of all creation. This is wrong. The Creator has placed knowledge in all things. Just because we humans have been given the gift of being able to stand outside ourselves does not mean that our knowledge is superior. We are not at the center of creation. We're just a part of creation. We Indians understand this. We know that the Creator placed special knowledge in everything. Tatanka, that's the buffalo, has a special knowledge. Wombly, the eagle, has a special knowledge. The plants, they each have special knowledge. Even little Shunka here, that's his little dog, has special knowledge. He rubbed Charles Bronson, that's his little dog, under the neck. The little dog shifted in Dan's lap and stared up at Dan with something close to love. It's not knowledge they can express because they can't stand outside themselves and think about themselves like we can. Their knowledge is pure. It's inside them. They can't express it, but they live it. It's our task as humans to watch them and listen to them and learn their knowledge, just as we must listen to the winds and the rivers and the trees and the stones. He hoisted himself upright in his seat and looked again directly in my face. His milky right eye was gleaming. We must stop looking at life as if we humans are at the top of everything. There's spirit in everything, not just in people. If the Creator made it, there is spirit in it. And if that is spirit in it, it has a part to play in creation. One more little passage. Here's where your people have lost the path. You have spent too much time thinking that we humans are at the top of everything. You have spent too much time trying to learn about things and not enough time trying to learn from them. You have thought too much and honored too little.
This perspective that he brings, this learning, this non-hierarchical process, tell us a little bit more about how that plays out in the trilogy, if you could.
Our whole philosophical tradition, our whole theological tradition is that we are put on the earth to improve it, to make it better, to redound to the glory of God, the city on the hill. The native people do not look at themselves as the apex of creation. They look at themselves as a part of creation. They say we were the last thing made. They say white people got it right. Your Bible got it right. You were the last thing made, but what that means is everything that was here before you was totally sufficient and able to function without your presence. You need them. They don't need you. And consequently, everything is a teacher. An oak tree teaches in a certain way. It teaches by having a strength and standing alone on a hill. You talked about how trees, they're always in an act of praise because their hands are up towards the sky.
Yeah.
The wolf teaches by always stopping and looking twice before it leaves. Everything has knowledge within it, and in their way of understanding, and this is a broad brush, but I think it's safe to say, if everything has spirit and everything has a lesson to teach, your job as a part of that is to watch and learn, not to use, but to honor and understand. And so this idea is present all through the books. And personally, as a writer, what I try to do in the first book is I try to animate the land. I want people to feel the presence of the land is alive. The storms is alive, the earth is alive, the mountains is like rocks pushing through skin, bones pushing through skin. The second book, weather, is very much what's alive. By the third book, I'm really bringing the people absolutely to the fore. I want readers to understand how these people think the way they do, what they came to understand, and the way that they honor the world around them and the relationships they have. So it's really an attempt all through the books to give us as readers a point of view that we as non-native readers may not have, and also to give voice to the native point of view that they may feel hasn't been properly expressed. Say one last thing in that regard, that I'm always very nervous as a non-native writer.
I was just going to go there. I wanted to say that I think this is such an important, because I have a number of friends, who as soon as I finished the book, I wanted to know, I wanted them to read it and tell me how they felt. And I think this dialogue that you have, this respectful dialogue, and the way Dan even says, you're doing okay, that continues by and large to be your experience, that this is a good walk in the two worlds.
It is, because we go back to the oral history. If I'm not putting myself in a position of interpretation, but instead taking the full voice of the native people and putting it in the characters, they're not hearing me. They're hearing themselves come back and speak, speaking from their understanding. I had one man, this is probably, you have wonderful moments as an author in any profession. One that mattered so much to me was I had a garage sale at our house up in Bemidji, and I had a big old scaffolding I used for sculpture, and I sold So a man came and he wanted to use it to hang deer. Okay, that's fine. So here's a nice guy who's from the reservation. And I said, I don't normally do this, but would you like a book that I wrote? Sure, I'll take that book. He took it, went home with it. He was not a very articulate man, but he called me, it was several weeks later, and said, I just want you to know, I took that book and I read it, and I've been sad my whole life, and I never knew why I was so sad. My family would sit around the table with me and they'd say, why are you so sad? And I didn't know why I was so sad. And I read this book and I understood why I was so sad. And I started talking to them. And I've not stopped talking since then. And
Wow.
I just want to thank you because you're my brother for doing this.
Wow.
So what that
Beautiful.
tells me, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful experience. And it said, I got things right. And I got things right by getting the heck out of the way and letting the native voices speak. I take you from where you are, and if you're a non-native reader, I take you out of your J. Crew and your Gap and your and your Rainbow Foods and put you in the car and take you to the reservation.
Yeah, we get
and
right in with you. Yeah.
And I hand you over to the people who tell you as authentically as I can give voice to it what they think about what they're seeing.
And I want to speak to that because I just told you that this first book I loved so much, and my father was in the hospital, and I read aloud to him much of the book. What was wonderful to discover in going to your reading, hearing you speak, was you talked about the importance of it as a read aloud, that you write to be, you do carry the oral tradition on, that the way you write is informed both by hearing, listening, hearing it aloud, and then also by your sculpture, those traditions. Can you talk a little bit more about that, just to help people understand that a little bit more?
Sure. I often say my dirty little secret is that I'm a subvocalizer. As a reader, I read very slowly. And consequently, I've learned to read and to write for people to listen, not to think. It's not to say there isn't thought embodied or embedded in the work, but it's meant to be heard.
Which, if I can say then, what you're really saying, I'm musical, so it's not just that, like you say, that separation between thought and listening. What you mean is it's a physical experience.
It is a physical experience,
and it's not separated.
No.
And so that experience of feeling it, I can tell you that as I would read a passage, my father, laying in his bed, would go, oh. He would sigh, or he would express in response to the way he heard it, because it is a feeling experience to read it.
And this, I want that to be there because this is the native way of expression. If we could go back and read or hear them in their original language, there was one writer who collected materials early on who said, listening to an old Indian talk is like a stroll through a forest. And I want my books to read like a stroll through a forest. I want them to be heard. I want them to be part of the oral tradition, that you need to take them in for their musicality, for their rhythms, and hopefully for their visual and sensory explanation of things. That I always want you to be present. I want you to be on the ground with me as the narrator. I don't want you to be able to step back and objectify and draw conclusions. Conceptualizing it's one of the strong suits of our Western mindset. We establish concepts by which we understand things. Narratives don't establish concepts. They tell stories.
They're meant to be experienced.
Yes, and so when I find myself pulling back and saying, this is what you need to understand about such and such, then I'm going way out, then I'm off the rails. So none of that, you don't find that in these books. You find storytelling as a tradition that's honored.
Yes. So you've concluded the trilogy with this last book, and does that feel satisfying?
Yes, it does. You reach a point where there's a sense of completion. There's still more I'd like to do, and that's not to say that I won't do it, but I will never carry this particular set of books further. The final book really had its origins, as I said the other night, in a terrible place called the Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians in Canton, South Dakota. That was the hook for the teaching and the historical unfolding. But the other side of it is that there is something in Native spirituality. There is Native philosophy, and that's the kind of things that I read from Wolf at Twilight. Mm-hmm. But then there are Native traditions that are deep spiritual traditions where we have no right to go as non-Native people, and many of the Native people don't have a right to go there. They're trained. You need to be trained. You need to learn about these deep traditions, and I wanted to walk to the edge of them in this book and say, here are some things. Look into the chasm of this place of understanding that we can't reach. And I brought people to the edge of it in this book. Because I brought them to the edge of it, I brought them to where I think is the edge of my capacity to express. I think I'm done. Mm-hmm.
Well, I know that it'll be a treat for anyone who has not read any of these stories. I really hope they begin at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I of course, haven't read the third, so I'll be getting started now that I've just picked up the book. What an achievement to bring us to this place, and I know that's probably not the right word because I hear this in such a respectful way, but your sharing of these stories has really changed my world. It's changed other friends' worlds, including those, a friend of mine who was taken from his family, and you met him, my friend Lenny, the other night. It has transformed a lot of people, and so I really urge people to read them because there is so much to receive in that process. How can they learn about you?
They can go to my website, which is www.kentnerburn, KENTNERBURN.com, and that's probably the best place.
One of the things I appreciated is that I did write to you you explained when I heard you last evening that you respond to emails, and I appreciate that you do. So if people are touched by the work, I know you write back.
I always try to write back. I tell people that I wrote to Norman Mailer when I was a confused graduate student, and Norman Mailer wrote back to me. It changed my life by saying, you can, with the single touch, you can do something of significance for a person. And so if I can touch someone by writing back, I'm happy to do so, and that's to Norman out there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. That's all we have time for. Come back again next week for the St. Paul Forum.